Ray, are you with us?
I am. Mm-hmm.
Welcome back to the show. Melvin Goodman, Sid and I here, we're talking about your legal troubles there at the 92nd Street Y. How did your hearing go in February?
Well, I went before the judge, and the judge looked down at me and said that the district attorney had offered what they call an ACD, which is an adjournment in contemplation of a dismissal, okay? And so she looked at me earnestly and said, Mr. McGovern, if you promise to be a law-abiding citizen for the next 6 months, all charges will be dropped. And my lawyer, knowing how I am given to garrulousness, she said, Ray, could you please just say yes when the judge says, do you understand? I said, yes, ma'am. Well, anyhow, I didn't make my speech, and I didn't compare myself to the kid gloves treatment that Petraeus has since. But it is pretty sublimely ironic, isn't it? Here's a guy with a ticket who wants to see what Petraeus is going to say, how those well-trained, crack Iraqi troops, John Brennan just said that they, quote, melted away, end quote, this time last year when ISIS showed up. So, that's kind of a handy admission. Melted away. Well, here's Petraeus and General Allen, between times when they're communicating with their loves in Tampa, they're bragging to Congress that they had trained hundreds of thousands of Iraqi troops, right? And the Afghan troops and so forth. And what happens when an AK-47 is shot by an ISIL fellow? They all run south. Now, they didn't, that's the exaggeration. They didn't all run. The officers took helicopters out of the area.
We're wondering, you were not arrested inside the 92nd Street Y. You didn't, it's not like you said, hey, Petraeus, I've got a question. You're so full of baloney. How about this? Somehow, somebody knew that you had bought a ticket before you even showed up at the 92nd Street Y. You ever think of that?
Well, I have, John, and I've talked to Bill Binney about this precise matter, and he says, Ray, don't you believe me? They got you in a little file. They're a very active file. They're keeping track of you. Yeah. And the proof is in the pudding, John, because I didn't buy a ticket. I had someone who I didn't even know, through a friend of mine, buy the ticket for me. And so, it could have been, what I think it might have been, when I come up to New York, I often stay with a Catholic worker down there in the Bowery.
Good for you.
Now I did email them and say, I'm coming up, and do you have a free bed for me? It's real cheap there, and it's nice to stay around with people really working with the poor. And by the way, I'm going to be teaching at Fordham and Manhattan College, and in the evening I'm going to see General Petraeus. Maybe I'll have a chance to ask him a question. That's all I said. But as you know, the Catholic Worker is an extremely subversive organization with international range. So that's as good a guess as any. I also had told the World Can't Wait folks, so it's equally possible, I suppose, that I know they monitor their phones because they're considered to be extreme leftist folks, and yet all they do is tell the truth as far as I can tell. So, yeah, it was quite an episode, and it's behind me now, and now we're still dealing with the time I got beat up for standing silently before Hillary Clinton. As
I didn't know about that. Tell it before we move on to Brennan and the CIA restructuring. Tell us about that incident.
Turning around and being silent?
Yeah, it was 15 February 4 years ago, I guess 2011, and the adulation she was receiving was just was reminiscent of what I used to watch in the Soviet Union when I watched Soviet leaders speak. After every paragraph and put off to the next day, there would be this little italicized, bold comment, "Бурные аплодисменты, все стоят," which means stormy applause. Everyone stands, right? So I said to myself, this is too much. So I stood up, turned my back on her, didn't say a word, didn't have any signs, anything like that. But I was in the fourth row. And the camera, there were 12 cameras there, and they saw this, and I had my Veterans for Peace shirt on, and so everything was going fine for about a minute and a half, and then this great big guy, looked like kind of a New York Giants reject, you know, he comes down, and from the front with a suit on, and then a guy takes me down from behind. Never saw him. He's got a uniform on. He's the GW police officer, and they beat me up pretty bad, put me in jail for about 5 or 6 hours. They released me and dropped all the charges that night, but a very, very responsible nonprofit legal firm called the Partnership for Civil Justice called me that night and said, "Hey, you know, this shouldn't happen. Would you like to see what we can do?" And I said, "Sure, but I don't have any money." They said, "Oh, don't worry about the money." I said, "Well, how do you support yourselves?" And the answer was really interesting, John. They said, "Well, you know, when we take on a case like this, we usually win, and then we make the government pay a lot of money. So don't worry about you paying us." Yeah, so that's coming to trial pretty soon now. They're taking depositions now, and it'd be interesting to see what happens, because Hillary was really, you know, was sort of Kafkaesque the way it all worked out, because the cameras caught me being wrapped up and brutally taken out of the thing, just as she was talking about the need to protect freedom of expression in Iran.
How old are you, Ray?
I'm 75 now.
So beating up a 75-year-old guy.
Well, no, don't exaggerate now. I was only 71 at the time.
Oh,
but
okay.
I'll tell you, John, that's an interesting thing, because she got thousands of emails and telephone calls. You know why? Because Americans don't like old people to be beat up.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, young people, they got to come in and out of. But old people, and that's a lesson for your listeners.
You know,
you got some gray in your hair. Put your body on the line. They're not going to kill you. They're not going to break your arm. But, you know, Americans really care about how old people are treated. So you have a special cachet that you really ought to put in play for all you people who are my age.
Well, we got a lot of Summer of Love era old hippies in this county. And I think you're preaching to the choir here. We've got a lot of people who've put a lot on the line over the years with protecting the redwoods, and still are, by the way. Here in Northern California, they use this Roundup to kill all the trees that are not lumber quality, like spruce or Douglas fir or redwoods, and they poison all the oaks. And we have forests who every other tree is a dead oak, and you have this. Yeah, I'll send you the aerial photos.
My good friend Alice Walker lives in your area.
Yeah, that's right, and so does Angela Davis, by the way.
Yeah, so it's a good county.
Yeah. Going back to Hillary Clinton, and before we go on to the subject at hand, which is the CIA restructuring under Brennan, and why he one of the things that came up with Goodman was why he just went to had the press conference, announced the restructuring before ever going to Congress first. Well,
Congress, see, he's got the president in the bag, and Congress is afraid to do anything. Congress hasn't done anything in terms of reining in the CIA since before 9/11. So, after 9/11, everything changed. You've heard that 100 times. Well, everything did change with respect to what used to be called the oversight committees, and now really should be called the overlook committees of both House and Senate.
All right. So before we get on to that, I want to ask you about Hillary Clinton. All right. You're the CIA. You're the CIA officer. Maybe you're the officer at the National Intelligence Council, overseeing Hillary Clinton and all this private server and all these emails, and now the disclosure today that she had aides who did not have security clearances reviewing all the emails. What would you make of it all? If you were at the National Intelligence Council, where would you go with Hillary Clinton and all these emails?
Well, I'd have her prosecuted.
Go on. Go on.
I mean, look, this is very serious stuff. I mean, if you're going to work with intelligence, you're going to handle the most sensitive documents, you're supposed to get cleared. Now, Petraeus didn't get his paramour cleared, and yet he was let go. So there are some people who are above the law, literally, and they act as though they're above the law. And this is incredibly noxious because those of us, well, let me put it this way. Those of us who are honest and kind of law-abiding and serious intelligence analysts, we took an oath. And it wasn't an oath to keep things secret. That was a little promise we did on a piece of paper because we needed to do that to get employed. Our oath was to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And so when we watch what has happened to the Fourth Amendment with General Hayden bragging about he had the power to dismiss the Fourth Amendment, he didn't have to say, as he put it, I didn't have to say, Mother, may I just knew that after 9/11 we had to dispense with those protections, blah, 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 blah. If you have Obama saying, well, the Fifth Amendment really doesn't count either, because we can kill Americans without due process, and his lawyers say, yeah, the Constitution doesn't say judicial process, it says just due process. So we do the due process right here in the White House. Thank you very much.
Yeah, a bunch of guys sitting around saying, yeah, okay, yeah, let's go ahead and kill him. That's a due process. Yep.
So, so it bothers us greatly. And when we see a guy like Petraeus, I mean, I can't pretend to be objective about him, but, just looking at the facts, those are those black binders contained all the names of the deep cover agents, both military and CIA, in Afghanistan. Now, that black folder was given to Petraeus a week before he knew, when he took over at CIA, that the security guys would be all around him and he couldn't do things like this anymore. So he gave it to Paula Broadwell, and then right around Labor Day, he picked it up again and put it back in his own house. What did she do with it for that week or 10 days? Did she give it to the Israelis? Did she give it to anyone? Who is she anyway? And why is she not brought up on charges? So, in answer to your question, John, there are people that act as though they're above the law, and sadly, the way things work out, look at Petraeus, they are above the law.
Yeah. Well, did you go to the... change the subject a little bit here and going back to Brennan. Did you go to the Council on Foreign Relations, Charlie Rose interviewing John Brennan?
I did. I'm in Washington. They were up in New York.
Right.
But I stayed up that night till 2:00 in the morning. Charlie Rose came on at 1:00, and so I saw the whole thing and had time to reflect on it. And actually wrote something. Right away, actually.
Well, we're going to talk.
Saturday.
We're going to talk about that. It's hot off the press. It's dated March 14th. It's in the consortiumnews.com. Guiding Obama into Global Make-Believe. The Orwellian concept of, I love the title, the Orwellian concept of information warfare holds that propaganda can break down our enemies, but also decide geopolitical outcomes. A strategy that has taken hold of the United States government's approach to international crises, especially recently in the Ukrainian showdown with Putin. Explain, Ray.
Well, John Brennan, in that interview with Charlie Rose, he said something that really boggled my mind. In a very condescending way, he said, no, neither Bill Clinton nor Barack Obama had much experience in intelligence-related matters. But now, quote, Obama has gone to school and understands the complexities, period, end quote. Now, I served under 9 directors and 7 U.S. presidents. Never have I heard that kind of condescending tone from a director of the CIA referring to a sitting president.
Right.
Okay? What does it tell me? Well, it tells me that Brennan has Obama in the bag. Obama is afraid of him. And Brennan has carte blanche to do whatever he likes. that is very, very dangerous. And this reorganization is going to vitiate the analysis side of the agency, which was the only side that Truman wanted when he's established the agency. And it's going to make it very difficult for substantive analysts in the analysis division, in which I worked most of my career of 27 years there, to make it really hard for them to come up with unbiased assessments when they're part of the team.
Yeah.
Take drones, for example. Okay, so the issues director for their little organization is running the drone program. Okay, and you're an analyst, right?
Yeah.
And so people say, what do you think about the long-term effects of the drone program? And you want to say, well, there's no better way to build up the lines at the recruiting stations for Al-Qaeda. I mean, if they want perpetual war, well, you're going to say that? No, you're not going to say that. You ain't going to be able to say anything. You know, I had used one example which I think speaks volumes. I don't know if we have time, but, you know, the curveball stuff before Iraq. Do you remember the guy who was alleged to have been an engineer in Iraq and told us about these mobile biological weapons?
Yeah, he was bipolar.
Yeah, yeah, he was.
He was.
But and they knew it. And you know, when the analysts, there was only one analyst. Okay, one person who interviewed Curveball on the U.S. side, and when he
Screwball
saw an early draft of Colin Powell's speech at the UN on February 5th, 2003, he wrote to his boss. Now, this is what's key here is that his boss was boss of one of these task forces, which puts the analysts and the operators together. Okay, it's sort of like these issues things that Brennan is trying to create on a larger scale. So here's what he says: "Hey, boss, Obama is talking about, quote, first-hand descriptions, end quote, by an Iraqi defector of a fleet of mobile bioweapons laboratories. He can't do that. He can't do that."
Yeah.
And here's what the response was, and this is what I'd like people to listen to. This is from the deputy chief of the CIA's Iraqi task force.
All right.
Quote, "Let's keep in mind the fact that this war is going to happen regardless of what Curveball said or didn't say, and that the powers that be probably aren't terribly interested in whether Curveball knows what he's talking about or not, period," end quote.
Wow.
Now, there it is, right?
That's the germ of the matter.
Yeah. So, you know, if that's what this reorganization means, where the analysts will be told by the supervisor, look, drones are us. We do drones. Don't be criticizing the long-term effect. Yeah, we know that for every person killed in Afghanistan, the extended family of 50 people are going to do jihad. But look, we're running the drones. We get a lot of money for running the drones. Keep quiet.
So one of the recurring themes here on our show is above the law. It seems so many people are above the law. How can we fix that?
Well, you know, it's difficult to say this, but I think we need to put our bodies into it. I think we need to show our elected leaders that we care about these things. There's a very big danger right now that Obama will weaken and give weapons to those fascist-led people in Ukraine. If he does that, John, mark my words, there will be a very, very strong reaction from Russia. And if the people advising Obama don't know that, well, we're in for trouble. And so what do we do here? Well, I think we have to approach it on all levels. Grassroots, I sent a memo or email to some really, really special Russian experts like Steve Cohen and, John Mearsheimer, who have said, Ukraine, we started it. We need to finish it. I'm hoping that we can do some sort of a forum which C-SPAN, CNN, which nobody can really neglect to say, look, this is very dangerous stuff. We started it. Never, John, have I seen a coup d'etat that was advertised 3 weeks before on YouTube. You probably know I'm referring to the intercepted conversation between Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, and our ambassador in Kiev. And she says, Yats is our guy. He knows about the central bank. He knows about Austereo. He's the guy. Klitschko, the other guys can wait in the wings. And what do we see? Well, the day after the coup, on the 23rd of February, who becomes the prime minister?
Yeah, he's in the wings.
Yats! Yats! Okay? Yatsenyuk. And he's still prime minister. So here we have,
Gee, I didn't think the CIA was in the business of military coups anymore.
Well,
I thought that went out in your generation.
Well, we specialize in all kinds of coups. This wasn't really a military coup.
No, it wasn't a military coup. It was It wasn't a military
kind of use of fascist and proto-fascist vanguard to chase Yanukovych away. Now, the interesting thing here is that you may know this, and your listeners may know this, but Putin has made a documentary 2 hours long on how Crimea was reattached to Russia.
Mm-hmm. I've seen it.
And the headlines in the Western press say, Putin planned seizure of Crimea well before it was seized, okay? And they go to a meeting on the 23rd of February where Putin told his associates, look, it may come to the fact that we'll have to take care of the people in Crimea and reattach it to us. Now, what did they leave out, these Western writers? They leave out that on the 22nd, on the 22nd, there was a coup d'etat. Mm-hmm. And the Russian, if I were a Russian, I would be afraid that the first thing you know, the new government would invite NATO into Sevastopol in the Crimea, where the Russians have their lone warm water port. And so it was a matter of what to do. And what Putin explains is that, we advertise our special forces and all the things they can get. Well, Putin doesn't advertise them except right now. And he's saying that Spetsnaz, that's what they call their special forces, they reinforced Crimea sort of on the QT. They were allowed under a treaty with Ukraine 20,000 military there in Sevastopol, Simferopol, and the other parts of Crimea. And so they did that gradually. Putin claims he didn't exceed the 20,000 limit, and I don't know whether to believe that or not, but those fellows, remember in the dark and the masks and all that kind of stuff? Mm-hmm. Well, they were. Now he's admitting, he said, we made sure that the Ukrainian people couldn't, the Ukrainian forces there couldn't separate Crimea from Ukraine or from anyone else. And so we made sure that we were prepared. And then there was a referendum. Putin said that his information was that there would be 75% support for rejoining Russia. In the vote, it turned out larger. Granted, some people stayed away. And so it was very well planned. But it all started on the 23rd of February. The American people don't know what happened on the 22nd, namely the pre-advertised on YouTube coup d'etat in Kiev. Then they missed the whole context, and that's what we're up against. That's what the propaganda is misleading the American people in that key respect. And if they don't know that, they don't know much about what's going on in Ukraine, and you can forgive them for not knowing very much because, well, I've said it, I try to say it every time, 53 years in this town gives you some perspective, makes it clear that you've seen a lot of change, John, but there's one change that dwarfs all the other changes in significance, and that is that we no longer have in any real sense a free media, and that is big. Now, if it weren't for shows like yours and the Internet, we would be really in deep kimchi. Yeah. I'm hoping that people will get onto the fact that they can find out the truth, but it's going to take all of us, and it's going to take some putting our bodies into it to make that point.
So let's get to that question. Why would the President of the United States be afraid of anybody? Why would the President of the United States be afraid of John Brennan, CIA director?
Well, aside from all the empirical evidence that I can adduce to justify that observation, let me add a vignette that I have reason to believe. Now, this is not first-hand information. It comes from a very good friend, very knowledgeable guy, very reliable guy, who heard it from his friend. Here's what happened. Right before the election, Obama's having dinner with a very well-heeled group of contributors, progressive people, and they're saying, Mr. President, why don't you, you're supposed to be progressive. Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Finally, before dessert, he stands up. And he says, look, thanks for pinging on me, folks, but don't you remember what happened to Dr. King?
All right.
Now, I can understand that, but if he felt that way, I don't think he should have tried to become president, okay? And he knows, for example, what most Americans don't know, that Dr. King, just as, Dr. King was killed by the U.S. government. Right. That's proven in a court of law. The civil suit proved that, okay? The King family wouldn't relent, and they came down, the judge and the jury said, yes, he was killed by a combination of federal and local police officials, okay? Now, so that's the reality. Now, what does he have to be afraid of? Well, there's another guy that got killed, and he was the president, and his name was John Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And if anyone wants to know what I think the best book on this is, it's called this. Get your pencils out. JFK and the Unspeakable. That's the title. JFK and the Unspeakable, written by James Douglas with 2 S's on the end. It is a masterful work, and I won't give away the conclusion, other than to say I find it very persuasive that there were all kinds of people out to get JFK, and the same kinds of people will be out to get Obama now. So he's treading a very careful path. I don't justify it. I think that vignette that I started out with is probably true. Judging from the provenance, the guy who told me that would not be telling me this kind of stuff idly. And so if he's afraid, Brennan, after all, knows where all the bodies are buried. Right. He knows all the people who've been killed by drones and everything else. And, of course, NSA, well, you've talked to Russ Tice, what NSA has, even on Senator Obama and even before he was senator. So these fears have a certain justification, but they're unseemly at best.
And what I want to tell our listeners is that John F. Kennedy himself talked about a government within a government. April 27th, 1961, in an address that President Kennedy made at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel before the American Newspaper Publishers Association, he explicitly warned against a quote-unquote ruthless and monolithic government within a government. A government within a government, secret society of the power elite that we've now seen come to pass in the 40 years since his death. We know that it's not the 1%ers, it's the 1,000th of 1%ers against the rest of us, and then the rogue elements within the government that work for them. Am I nuts, Ray?
Well, you're not nuts. This was right at the time of the Bay of Pigs, and we know that Alan Dulles, who, by the way, insinuated himself onto the Warren Commission looking into the assassination of John Kennedy, Dulles controlled the witnesses. Dulles controlled the report. Dulles, in my view, was largely responsible for the assassination himself. So, Bay of Pigs, all right? Now, you said April 27th, 1961.
Correct.
That was exactly the time of the Bay of Pigs.
Right.
Now, what do we know about that? Well, we know that exactly a month after John Kennedy was assassinated, Harry Truman, and we know this from notes in his library, okay, he called Admiral Souders, who was this kind of intelligence guy, and he said, we have to write a piece now. We have to write a piece. And the piece appeared exactly 1 month after the Kennedy assassination. So on the 22nd December, 1963, what was said in that thing, what Harry Truman said was, look, the worst thing that can happen is an intelligence agency starts to give the president really bad information for its own purposes. And that's exactly what we know was happened with respect to the Bay of Pigs. We know we have the coffee-stained notes of Allen Dulles, former CIA director, in which he says, we'll make the landing on the beach, but then we'll run into trouble. There's no way that Kennedy will be able to stick to his admonitions that he would not send U.S. troops to help us. In other words, Allen Dulles and the smart guys in Washington knew that this young president would have to yield, and they'd finally get Fidel Castro, okay? Well, Kennedy didn't yield, okay? Kennedy said nuts, and he fired Allen Dulles to his peril. The next couple of years were spent trying to deal with that, and again, I suggest strongly that you read JFK and the Unspeakable, and you'll see that they were afraid, it was their personal animus, but it was also, hey, he was talking to Khrushchev behind everyone's back. He was talking to Castro, to intermediaries, and worst of all, John, worst of all, he had given 2 executive orders to pull out of Vietnam. One, 1,000 men out by the end of 1963, and the second executive order, the bulk of the rest of U.S. forces by the end of 1965. Now, easy to make the argument with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who were called by George Ball, the Deputy Secretary of State, a sewer of deceit, okay? Easy to make the case, hey, he's going soft on communism, domino theory, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, everything's going to go communist. We have to stop this. And whether LBJ was part of this, or whether he just was kind of sitting by, or maybe he was sort of informed, it was a cabal in my view, led by Dulles with the enthusiastic support of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. There were parts of the FBI involved. Even the Secret Service had 1 or 2 people involved. So. Read that, and if you want to think McGovern is an oddball or a conspiracy theorist, well, that's your privilege, but read the book first.
Ray, some kids have committed the Gettysburg Address to memory. I was so moved by Kennedy's address in 1961 to the Newspaper Publishers Association of America at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. I cried when I first, I loved this president, as most of America did. And I cried when I first heard this speech because it was an epiphany. I realized instantly, it was crystal clear to me why this man was killed. He was an imperfect man. He had personal flaws. Every man, I'm not going to be any kind of standard bearer. I've got more flaws than most. But this man stood for decency in government. This man stood for integrity in government. This man, all the things that you mentioned, these executive orders, including an executive order, told Israel he would not support a secret nuclear weapons program. I cried, Ray. I cried. Yeah. He signed his death warrant with that speech.
Well, that was a very prescient cry, if I may. There was such a thing as Camelot. Camelot and John Kennedy's speech at the inauguration, when he said, don't ask what the country's going to do for you, ask what you can do for you. Well, there are a whole bunch of us, John, some of us still alive, who came down to Washington expressly because of that. I was a senior in college at the time. I knew I had to do this. Yeah. Now, as soon as I joined the CIA, which was April 1963, we went off on this very high-fangled training program for junior officers who are going to be the management later, okay? Now, one of the lectures that we were, quote, treated to, end quote, was from a guy, an operator, who lambasted John Kennedy up and down as a coward, as a traitor, as somebody who didn't do the right thing on the Bay of Pigs. I think, in retrospect, that was E. Howard Hunt. But I got a feeling that day of the hate, of the unvarnished hate and contempt in which the president, the sitting president, was held by these people who were held up to us as agency operation leaders. Now, that's a personal reminiscence, and it struck me at the time, and I asked my colleagues, I said, is this appropriate? I mean, Kennedy's president, and they just kind of shook their head. But that kind of personal exposure to that kind of venom is just one small element why I'm very, very easily persuaded by the painstaking research of James Douglas that this is what happened, that Dulles was largely responsible for covering it up, and that Dulles did a masterful job of covering up, for example, the op-ed in the Washington Post exactly 1 month after Kennedy's death, which, interestingly, where Truman says, we can't let the operational part of the agency dominate, we should get rid of the operational part of it. This is not what I intended. Truman says that there. Guess what? 3 editions of the Washington Post daily in those days, it disappeared from the 2nd and the 3rd edition. No media play, except the small paper out in Independence, Missouri. So if Bill Colby, former CIA director, was exaggerating by saying, we have control of a very important person in the U.S. media, well, he was only exaggerating by a little bit, because they deep-sixed this. And here's another little vignette that James Douglas picked up. What happened was that there were problems with Allen Dulles being on the Warren Commission, because people said, well, he may have done it, So he went out to Kansas City on a pretext to giving a speech, and he dropped by the Truman Library after his speech. And on a one-on-one thing, he said to Harry Truman, now, you didn't write that thing, did you, the 22nd of December 1963? You don't believe that stuff, do you? Well, all we have is Dulles' account of how that conversation went. He wrote a memorandum 3 days later. He gave it to Larry Houston, who was one of the very earliest brass of the CIA. He was the general counsel. And what he said in the memorandum was, Harry Truman has disavowed what he said, and what supposed it said in that op-ed. He didn't believe that for a minute, so put that in the file, okay? Now, why was he doing that? He was doing that because, if Harry died or something, or somebody brought this thing up, then he'd say, I dictated a thing, and Larry Houston has that in the files, and then they'd drag it out and say, well, Truman disavowed that. The only problem was that Truman gave an interview to Look magazine 3 months later, and he said exactly the same thing as he said in that op-ed. So Dulles was watching himself. Dulles was enlisting all his old friends to cover his rear end, and he did get on the Warren Commission. He did pretty much orchestrate the witnesses, and the result was typically skewed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and yes. We'll do a separate show on that with you. There's so much there, and so much there. You mentioned Martin Luther King as well. Listeners should know, and this has all been declassified right now at this point in time. And I imagine it's in both in the National Archives and at the Martin Luther King Center. That Martin Luther King was, and you can speak to this as well, Ray, was a target of an FBI program known as CONINTELPRO. That this was a counterintelligence program. It was initiated by the FBI against Dr. King in August 1967 against the Southern Christian Leadership Program. and in March 1968 against King specifically, and resulted in King staying at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. The FBI's COINTEL program paid members of a group called the Invaders, a group that COINTELPRO formed, an organization of young black activists in Memphis, and acted through their informants in the Invaders to incite violence on March 28th that brought Dr. King to Memphis. The FBI had foreknowledge of the assassination through surveillance, through informants, and through other means, and that the Bureau also had the use of an undercover agent and informant that acted with James Earl Ray in the assassination of Dr. King. This was all part of the FBI's COINTEL program. Ray, do you have any comment?
I do. That's all quite true. And one interesting aspect of this is J. Edgar Hoover having the power to intimidate, blackmail, whatever, everyone. And when I say everyone, I include John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and the rest. Now, is there any evidence of that? Let me give you this one. You know, I've often wondered why it was that Bobby Kennedy, for whom I still have a lot of respect, would sign a warrant authorizing J. Edgar Hoover to do that kind of intrusive surveillance on Martin Luther King Jr. and end up with the FBI sending a letter to Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King, revealing all his indiscretions there with other women and all that kind of stuff, and suggesting no less that he commit suicide. How could Bobby Kennedy authorize that? Well, I asked my friend Colleen Rowley about that. A FBI lawyer and special agent, who divulged all the mistakes the FBI did before 9/11. Okay, she said, Ray, come on, think about it, Ray. J. Edgar Hoover had all the information on those comely young women that went swimming in the White House pool with Bobby and his big brother, and you know, a lot of this stuff is pretty insidious, Ray, but you should be able to understand it by now.
Right.
And holy Moses, you know, Bobby Kennedy also on J. Edgar Hoover's list, and also afraid of him, and that's the point I'm trying to make on Obama.
Right.
He's afraid.
Yep, I'm glad you brought it back to that. Why the President of the United States would be afraid of the CIA director. It's hard to believe, but that's been the case since J. Edgar Hoover and John Kennedy. How and why did it start then? I mean, why did it seem like Eisenhower and Eisenhower warned of the military-industrial complex in the last speech of the White House, of course, but how and why did all that change around the Kennedy administration? Do you have any insights into that?
Yeah, actually, I like Ike, but we can't let him off the hook here. I mean, he was a guy that condoned and sort of approved the Bay of Pigs thing. He was also intimidated by, we're talking about an establishment, okay? We're talking about John Foster Dulles as well as Allen Dulles, the epitome of the Eastern establishment, which were running foreign policy as well as intelligence after the war. And so we had during Eisenhower's reign, the coup in Iran, where the Shah was put in. The Shah, who had a secret police that rivaled the Gestapo, was put in substituting for the duly elected, the only freely elected premier of Iran, Mossadegh. That was in 1853. Then United Fruit got up in arms because this fellow called Arbenz in Guatemala, he thought, get this, he had this ridiculous idea that the peasants in Guatemala should be able to cultivate some of that fallow land that all belonged to United Fruit. Didn't he know? Didn't he know that belonged to United Fruit? Well, he was branded a, quote, leftist, okay, and that's all you needed in those days. and there was a coup sponsored by the United States. So the CIA was riding high by the time Eisenhower left. So, and they kind of had a lot of money and a lot of support in the press. And if Bill Colby is to be believed, they had not only had support in the press, but they had the press thoroughly infiltrated. The trade name is an agent of influence, right? Well, that's what Sulzberger, for example, is still in the Times. Why did he sit? Why did he sit for 14 months on the story that revealed, James Risen revealed, that the U.S. government was willy-nilly violating everything in the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable searches and seizures without a warrant, and specifically defining the places to be searched and the people to be seized? Okay. Well, why did Sulzberger, who knew that months before the 2004 election, why did he prohibit Risen from writing that? And why did he only relent when Risen approached him 14 months later, December 2005, and said, this is so embarrassing, Mr. Sulzberger, but, I have to tell you, my book's in galley now, and you're still paying me big bucks, and people are going to wonder why this story isn't in the paper. So, you know what he did?
What's that?
Sulzberger went into the Oval Office personally with the bureau chief in Washington and talked to Bush and said, sorry, Mr. President, the die is cast. It's in galley. We can't prevent the book. And Bush said, no, you can't do that. Can't. National security, national manual of the national terrorism determined. You can't do that, okay? And he said, I'm sorry, Mr. President. And he walked out, okay? Now, it was only 10 days later when the New York Times published that story. So here we have all the news that's fit to print. Forget about it. It's all the news that the White House says is okay to print. That's a big, big change.
Yeah. I'm starting to get questions from listeners on the internet, and I had one who asked me, is the FBI, even though CONINTELPROs may have been disbanded by the FBI, are they still involved in any of these dirty tricks? Does the name Vincent B. Lisi ring a bell, Ray?
How do you spell that last name?
Lisi.
No, it doesn't.
Vincent, I just copied you on a link that to a show I did on this guy. He's the current FBI agent in charge of the Boston office. This was a time when it followed the Boston Marathon bombings, which coincided with martial law being declared for an entire metropolitan area, which I believe was a dress rehearsal for martial law being declared in the country. Vincent Lisi was a counterintelligence agent for the FBI. He worked with the FBI's Anti-Terrorism and National Security Unit of the Department of Justice National Security Division. He worked in Yemen. He worked for the U.S. Treasury, the Inspector General's office, etc. I believe he's one of the most dangerous men in the country because he's the guy who framed, remember the anthrax letter scare?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He's the guy who framed that the FBI, the scientist Bruce Irvins, formerly of Fort Detrick, who I may add received the highest award that a civilian can receive by the Department of Defense over this anthrax, the particular anthrax strain, something called RMR 1029. They did a genetic analysis of those particular anthrax spores. Framed that guy that led to his suicide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, at least he got promoted for that, obviously.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, it's thoroughly corrupt. I mean, here's a little vignette. I went to a big soiree, actually this big conference, 300 people at Georgetown University, run by the CIA and the national security folks at Georgetown University. First up was Bob Mueller, who had just retired from the FBI. So I said to Mr. Mueller, I was first at the Q&A. I said, Mr. Mueller, I'm interested in this concept of parallel construction, where you take illegally obtained eavesdropping information and you tip off local authorities to, let's say, a drug bust at the corner, and then they in turn bust these folks and then reconstruct how they might have come by that information under legal means. What do you think of this parallel construction? It sounds unconstitutional.
Parallel construction.
To me.
Oh, that's the second time we've heard this.
Yeah. So he says, Mr. McGovern, we were given a lot of authorities after 9/11, many authorities. Yes, we have a lot of authorities. Yes. The next question?
Good answer.
You know, Bill Binney spoke openly about parallel, setting people up with parallel construction cases and what he also called planned perjury programs.
Yeah, that's what it amounts to. Yeah.
Now, but why frame a guy like Dr. Bruce Irvins, a distinguished scientist, again, the recipient of a DOD award? Why have an anthrax letter scare? Why set up an innocent guy? What's in it for these insiders that Kennedy warned us about? What's in it for them?
A big promotion for Lisi. Now, that sounds ridiculous on the face of it. But if you get Lisi running this kind of investigation and great pressure on the FBI to come up with some kind of culprit for this, it went on years, and they couldn't find, and they had great evidence. I don't know why they never found the real person.
Right.
But if you get this concentration of pressure and ambition, then you get people who are ambitious and don't care about the truth and don't care about other people. I mean, this poor guy was crucified, and he committed suicide. So,
apparently committed suicide. On the morning of July 27, 2008, he was found unconscious in his home. He was taken to Frederick Memorial Hospital, not far from your neck of the woods, on an apparent overdose of Tylenol. That wouldn't be the way I'd do it.
No, that wouldn't.
Yeah.
No, do you remember that? An apparent dose of Tylenol?
I don't remember that.
Well,
no.
It's in my article. It's
a little suspicious. Yeah.
It's all pretty goofy, and I think it's larger than just one man seeking a promotion, one ambitious, sociopathically ambitious guy seeking a promotion. I think it's bigger budget for his unit, ultimately a bigger budget for the FBI, ultimately a bigger budget for national security agencies, spying on its own citizens, regarding them as domestic terrorist threats, seeing those threats everywhere.
Yeah, I don't exclude that, John. I'm just saying that Lisi's ambition was a factor there. I also mentioned the great pressure on the FBI to come up with some kind of solution to this thing. So I think we're not far off, not far divergent in our opinions here.
Ray, we've got to wind it up. We've got 5 minutes left. We're going to ask you the same question we asked Melvin Goodman. You've been called into the office of the next president. Hopefully it's a she. Hopefully it's Elizabeth Warren. And President Warren asked you, Mr. McGovern, we've taken a look at CIA Director Brennan's plan to restructure the CIA. We think it's all wrong. How would you do it, sir?
Well, President Warren, it's actually very simple. You have to decide whether you want a kind of CIA that Harry Truman envisaged and put in the legislation, namely an analysis unit free of Pentagon or State Department interference, a place where he could go for a straight answer based on all the information on a given country or issue. That's the central part of Central Intelligence Agency. We have experience indicating that if you give people career protection for telling the truth, as some of us had during Vietnam and other places, you have the option to have real unadulterated information. Now, Brennan's reorganization has left the station. It's too late. He's got all these mission groups here where the operators will be in control, the analysts will be intimidated. What you need to do, Mr. President, Mrs. Warren, or Miss Warren, is this. You need a separate analytical outfit, responsive solely to you. You need to people that with prominent academics, business people, and intelligence analysts above reproach, not formally involved in intelligence antics, and you need to separate that from the operational people. Only then do you have the kind of agency that Truman knew was needed. He said in that op-ed of 22 December 1963, the operational part of the CIA should be discarded or moved elsewhere. That's what we think should be done now. You should know, Miss Warren, or Madam President, you should know that the legislation to create the CIA was already in 1947 when the operators came back from World War II, the OSS, the people who overthrow governments. We call it regime change now, but that's what it was, overthrowing governments. We wanted to have the similar capability to what the KGB had, and we needed a place to put them, and some jerk, some dumbo decided, well, we'll put them in with the analysts. And they justified that by one sentence inserted in the National Security Act of 1947, which says the Director of Central Intelligence shall perform such other functions and duties as the President shall from time to time direct. Well, that was never meant to justify illegal activities.
And instead of talking, we're going to do something about it.